What they didn't teach you about the Renaissance. The Renaissance is often portrayed as a golden age of art, culture, and intellectual revival. We learn of its great thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Galileo, and marvel at the masterpieces they created during a time of unparalleled creativity. But beyond the famous stories of breathtaking frescoes and groundbreaking discoveries, there is a lesser-known side to the Renaissance, one filled with intrigue, contradictions, and challenges that paint a more complex picture of this fascinating period in history. Here's what they didn't teach you about the Renaissance. The dark side of patronage. Power, control, and censorship. While we celebrate the beauty of Renaissance art, we rarely talk about the darker side of patronage. Behind many of the era's most famous works stood powerful patrons, wealthy families like the Medicis, popes, and European monarchs, who funded the creation of art not just for the sake of beauty, but also for political and religious influence. These patrons had a strong hand in dictating what artists could and could not create, sometimes imposing strict guidelines on content to serve their own interests. For example, artists working for the Catholic Church often had to create works that promoted religious orthodoxy and reinforced the authority of the Church. For many artists, the pressures of satisfying their powerful patrons were immense. Michelangelo, for instance, was famously coerced into painting the Sistine Chapel by Pope Julius II, despite his preference for sculpting over painting. And in some cases, artists faced censorship or even destruction of their work if it did not align with their patrons' expectations. This tight control over artistic expression demonstrates how even in a period of immense creativity, power, and politics could limit true artistic freedom. The role of women in the Renaissance. Unsung heroines of the era. When we think of the Renaissance, the contributions of women are often overlooked. Yet, women played a crucial role in the period's cultural and intellectual life, despite being excluded from many of the formal avenues of power. Educated women from wealthy families, such as Isabella d'Este and Catherine de' Medici, were influential patrons of the arts and used their positions to support artists, musicians, and writers. They helped shape the cultural landscape of the time, often guiding trends in fashion, art, and literature. Some women even managed to become successful artists themselves, though their names are far less recognized than their male counterparts. Artemisia Gentileschi is perhaps the most famous example of a female painter who achieved renown during the Baroque period, which followed the Renaissance. But there were others like Sofonisba Anguissola, who painted portraits for European royalty. These women had to navigate a male-dominated world where their talents were often undervalued or dismissed, yet they left an indelible mark on Renaissance culture. The Renaissance wasn't just in Italy, a pan-European movement. When we think of the Renaissance, we often imagine the bustling streets of Florence or the grand palaces of Venice, but the Renaissance was far more than an Italian phenomenon. While Italy was the birthplace of the movement, its influence quickly spread across Europe, sparking unique interpretations and developments in other countries. In the North, the Northern Renaissance produced artists like Albrecht Dürer, Jan van Eyck, and Hieronymus Bosch, whose works were often darker and more focused on religious themes than their Italian counterparts. In France, the Renaissance took on a different flavor, blending the Italian love for classical antiquity with the French tradition of Gothic architecture. French monarchs like Francis I imported Italian artists to decorate their palaces, and soon the Renaissance spirit began to infuse everything from literature to philosophy across the region. England, too, had its Renaissance, particularly in literature, where the works of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser defined the era. While the Italian Renaissance is often the most celebrated, it's important to remember that the movement had an extensive reach, influencing a wide range of cultures and artistic traditions across Europe. The Renaissance wasn't all about beauty, a time of violence and turmoil. Despite its reputation as a peaceful era of intellectual flourishing, the Renaissance was anything but a time of tranquility. Europe during this period was rife with violence, warfare, and political instability. The Italian city-states, for example, were constantly embroiled in power struggles, wars, and political intrigues, as powerful families like the Medicis, the Sforzas, and the Borgias fought for control. Assassinations, betrayals, and feuds were common, and many of the era's greatest minds had to navigate a world filled with danger and uncertainty. Religious tensions were also on the rise. The Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, led to bitter conflicts between Catholics and Protestants across Europe. Religious wars, inquisitions, and persecution became increasingly common as the Catholic Church sought to maintain its power in the face of growing Protestant movements. These religious conflicts would go on to shape much of Europe's political landscape for centuries to come. Even everyday life during the Renaissance was far from idyllic. The peasantry often lived in harsh conditions, and plagues, including the Black Death, continued to ravage populations. Superstition and fear of witchcraft were widespread, leading to witch hunts and executions across Europe. The Renaissance may have been a time of intellectual and artistic achievement for some, but for many others, it was a period marked by suffering and hardship. The science of the Renaissance, a battle between old and new. The Renaissance is often celebrated as a time of scientific discovery and innovation, with figures like Copernicus, Galileo, and Leonardo da Vinci leading the way. But what's often overlooked is the fierce resistance that these new ideas faced from traditional authorities, particularly the Catholic Church. Galileo, for example, famously clashed with the Church over his support of the heliocentric model of the universe, which placed the Sun, not the Earth, at the center of the solar system. His insistence on promoting these ideas led to his trial by the Inquisition and his eventual house arrest. Many Renaissance thinkers were deeply influenced by classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome, and as a result, the period saw a revival of interest in long-held ideas about science and medicine. However, the transition from a reliance on ancient wisdom to the development of modern scientific methods was not a smooth one. For every breakthrough in anatomy or astronomy, there were still plenty of outdated beliefs that persisted, such as the idea of the four humors in medicine or the use of alchemy to turn base metals into gold. The Renaissance was a period of incredible intellectual tension, as old ways of thinking were challenged by new ideas. The battle between tradition and innovation would continue well into the Enlightenment, but the seeds of modern science were sown during this tumultuous time. The Renaissance, a time of glory, struggle, and transformation. The Renaissance is often romanticized as an era of pure brilliance, but its reality was far more complex. It was a time of contradictions, where beauty and brutality, enlightenment and superstition coexisted in the same breath. From the power struggles of the ruling elite to the overlooked contributions of women and the harsh realities faced by ordinary people, the Renaissance was much more than a simple rebirth of classical ideals. It was a time of immense cultural and intellectual transformation, but it was also a period of great challenges and uncertainties that shaped the course of history. In understanding the Renaissance in all its complexity, we gain a richer appreciation for the true nature of this fascinating era, a time that was far from perfect but undeniably pivotal in the shaping of the modern world.